Okay, let's get started. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
Good. Thanks for talking with us today. So, we're going to ask you a couple questions. And the first one is tell us a little bit about you and where you work.
Well, I work at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I'm a professor of anthropology there. I've been there about 14 years, 14 or 15 years. Before that, I worked for the Maryland Historical Trust at Jeff Pat. And what I do is I read, write about, and teach Chesapeake and Middle Atlantic history and archaeology.
Yes, I met you many years ago at Jefferson Patterson Park, my first job in archaeology. You
That's
were
right.
there of the Mac Lab. Yep. So, what is your favorite thing about your job?
My favorite thing about my job, there are a lot of favorite things about my job because when you are doing archaeology in an academic environment, it can be very tough, but it can also be very freeing. So I can do work not just in Maryland, but I can do work in other areas. And as you know, I do some of my work in Virginia and then a lot of it in Maryland. But my favorite thing to do is to take students and staff out into the world, field trips, and to encourage them to read the landscape as an archaeologist would, to see the hidden stories that are in the landscape that are actually not really hidden. But when you start to get that archaeological sensibility, you start to see stories that might not otherwise get told all the time. So that is one of my most favorite things to do. And the season, April, Archaeology Month, it's coming up to start doing that, hopefully with the pandemic behind us soon.
Our host for sure. So, talk about how did you get into archaeology and what has kept you in it all these years?
You know, I wanted to be in archaeology, and you can cut me off at any time because it's kind of a long story. But since I was a little kid, my father and mother owned an excavating construction company, and he would bring home sand piles for me to play in. I was the oldest of five girls. And so, they had to give me something to do, and I'd play in these sand piles and I'd bury my Tonka trucks. And I was very interested in history because of my mom. She was really interested into it. And she pulled my dad into it, my grandparents, and she would pack us up into the car and go to Colonial Williamsburg. So I was very committed to some kind of historical profession early on. When I was in 10th grade, I wrote a letter to Ivor Noel Hume and told him I wanted to be an archaeologist and could I come down and meet with him? And I did. And he met with me. He was extremely gracious. He was very nice. Those of you who have read his books know that he can be a little biased about women in the field, or was a little biased about women in the field, but I didn't feel any of that. And then I left that meeting thinking, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And the beauty of it was that I was a female child. And so if I had been born a male child, I would have been running a construction company today. But I was a female child, and my parents, I think, didn't see it in quite the same light. So I ended up going into archaeology. So I like to tell people that, hey, sexist attitudes, helped get me into archaeology, and I'm very thankful for it.
So, what keeps you in the field after all these years?
Oh my gosh, I can't think of anything else I would rather be doing. And it just gets better. The more you learn about, Maryland and Middle Atlantic history and archaeology, and you realize how much is out there that you don't know, and that one lifetime is not enough to do it. And it's really, I will say this about being an archaeologist, it helps you learn about this broader world, both spatially and through time, but it also helps you learn about yourself and your position, where you are in the world. It helps you understand things like inequity and social justice and uh, uh, questions like that in a way that you might not if you didn't have this incredible historical view that archaeology forces us to engage with.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think it really can ground you and provide so much context to modern America. So to that topic, I want to now switch over to talking about your Maryland Archaeology Month essay. So talk to us about this very interesting essay you wrote and the research you did.
So this was when I was working for the trust at Jeff Pat, and I guess it was in the 80s. We excavated a site that was threatened with development in Calvert County. It's called Patuxent Point, and it was a circa 1658 to 1695 domestic household near Solomon's, if people know where that is. And close to the end of the project, as always happens, it wasn't the last day, but it was close to the last day. We found a feature that looked like a post hole, but it just kept getting longer and longer. So we knew it wasn't a post hole. We knew it was a grave. And of course, that was both very scary because there's all sorts of things that you have to do when you encounter human remains. And even then, it was pre-NAGPRA, but people were still starting to get a sense of the importance of really thinking closely and carefully about what we do when we work with human remains. We did excavate. We got permissions from the various agencies that we had to, and we excavated the cemetery. There were 18 or 19 individuals. And Doug Ubelacher at the Smithsonian Institution did the analysis. And he did it for next to nothing because this was a project where this was not a lot of money, although Governor Schaefer had invested a little bit in it. And we were really surprised at the extent of bone loss. And of course, bone loss is not unusual in modern populations, but there was a lot of bone loss in 5-year-old children, osteoporosis, spina bifida, other forms of bone loss in young people, in young men, as well as older women and older people that you might expect. And especially after the work of historians and zooarchaeologists who had argued that there were no starving times in Maryland during this period, and that there were adequate food resources. The question is, what's going on? Because these bodies were definitely in some kind of stress. So I was working with a student, and she was a co-author along with Doug Ubelacher on the article that we published in Historical Archaeology. Her name is Annie Fung, and she has since gone on to work in nursing. So she made a career out of the interest that developed as a result of working with these human remains. She took a deep dive into the causes of bone loss, and she was looking at all this stuff on the NIH website and medical things, and she found that some of the biggest culprits are tobacco, alcohol, and excessive protein consumption. And they were big practices in the Chesapeake, and they actually drain or absorb the calcium out of people's bones. And this was reflected not just in the adults, but also in the children who, people didn't drink water. They weren't drunks, but they consumed a lot of alcohol. And so that was really very interesting. And it showed how human skeletal remains bring a different dimension to a narrative that was saying that the diets were adequate, right? There was plenty of food. And that's true. There was plenty of food. But the as you drill down into it, it's the quality of the food and then the quality of, alcohol and tobacco consumption.
So, given that we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, do you see that this research is relevant today? Do you see parallels to what's happening
today? Excuse me. I think that what this research does, and research like this, and probably the other essays in the Maryland Archaeology Month booklet, is that they give time depth to health research, and they give access to data that might not necessarily appear to people who are interested in health. And it can only be a good thing to get this time depth. It's not just the biology of health and disease, although we all acknowledge that that's a really important thing, especially with the COVID-19. We've all, I think, gotten lessons on, how viruses work and the little ball with its, legs sticking out of it. But it's also the cultural practices, right? The cultural practices that health isn't just a biological issue, that it's also a social and cultural issue. And you see not just the biology, but you see the politics, the structural inequities, the practices, for example, the consumption of tobacco, that really can affect and determine and impact the health of communities. And archaeology can provide that time depth. I mean, there's a whole field now, well, it's been there in anthropology called medical anthropology that addresses these kinds of questions. They're usually dealing with modern living ethnographic groups, but archaeology, I think, has a lot to say about that.
That's a very good. So I guess the last question is, speaking of COVID, what is the first thing that you want to do once this is all over and behind us?
Well, I feel because I live in St. Mary's City and in a very rural area, I'm just sort of doing what I always do, which is I don't go out among a lot of people. But I will tell you that the first thing I'm going to do is Labor Day weekend is a big weekend for my colleagues in Charleston, South Carolina. We were all in graduate school together, and we didn't get together last Labor Day. We've been getting together every Labor Day for decades, really. It's frightening to think of it that way. But we're going to get together, probably go to St. Augustine, where we all met when we were in graduate school. But a lot of them now live in South Carolina, and spend Labor Day, checking out the sites and being tourists in the oldest city, which, of course, as we know, we should qualify it. It's the oldest European city. But I can't wait to do that. It's just a few months out.
I am looking forward to gathering with my friends for sure again. Well, thank you, Julie. It was so nice talking to you today and learning a little bit more about you and about your topic. Thanks.
Well, thank you.